Today, we're diving into a landmark case in international law. It's a wild story about naval explosions, a nation that just walked out of its own trial, and a court that had to deliver a verdict to, well, an empty chair. This is the Corfu Channel case.
I mean, really think about that question for a second. Imagine a court rules against an entire country, and that country's response is to just disappear from the proceedings. What are you supposed to do then? Can a system like international justice even work if someone can just decide not to play along?
Okay, so let's set the stage. To understand why Albania walked out, we have to start with the verdict that kicked this whole thing off.
So on April 9, 1949, the International Court of Justice came down with a really clear judgment. They said, yes, Albania was responsible for these explosions that completely wrecked British warships and tragically killed naval personnel. The court decided Albania had to pay. The only question left was, how much?
And on that one little question, everything fell apart. The UK's position was simple. Hey, court, you have the power to decide the final bill. But Albania just dug in its heels. They argued that, no, the court could only rule on the idea of payment, not the actual number. The amount, they said, had to be worked out in a totally separate deal. And that single disagreement, that became the flashpoint for everything that followed.
So, faced with a process it completely rejected, Albania decided to do something pretty radical. It just abandoned the case.
And that was that. Albania formally announced it was done. They weren't just going to protest, they were completely walking away, leaving the United Kingdom to argue its case against an empty defendant's bench.
This move threw a huge wrench into the works for the court. I mean, it's a fundamental question, right? What power does a court really have if a whole country can just ignore it? Does the entire system just fall apart? Or is there some way to move forward?
Well, the court didn't back down. Not at all. Instead, it kicked off a formal process to investigate the UK's claim all by itself.
They used a specific legal tool called the procedure in default of appearance. It sounds complicated, but it's actually a pretty critical mechanism. It basically allows a case to continue even if one side refuses to show up. It makes sure that you can't just stop justice in its tracks by walking out of the room.
The very first thing the court did was tackle Albania's argument head-on. It stated very firmly that its power to decide the amount of money wasn't up for debate anymore. That issue, the court said, had already been settled in its first judgment back in April.
What the court was doing here was invoking a core legal principle called res judicata. It's a fancy Latin term that just means the matter has been judged. Once a final decision is made, you can't just keep re-arguing it. The court's message was crystal clear. We've already ruled on this, it's final, and we are moving on.
Now, this is super important. This was not an automatic win for the UK. The court made it very clear that even with Albania gone, it still had a duty to check the UK's math. It couldn't just rubber stamp the request. Every penny had to be proven to be a legitimate and legally sound claim.
So the court followed this really clear, careful process. It kicked off the default procedure, it confirmed its jurisdiction was a done deal, and then, to make sure everything was fair, it brought in outside experts to give an impartial report on the UK's financial claim. And that report would be the basis for its final decision.
And who were these experts? The court appointed 2 naval construction specialists from the Netherlands, a neutral country, which was a smart move. Their only job was to go through the UK's financial claims for the damaged ships and figure out if the numbers were accurate and fair. They handed in their big report on December 2, 1949.
Okay, so with that expert report in hand, the court could finally move to its last task, actually calculating the final cost.
The UK's claim was really broken down into 3 main parts. First, the cost to replace the destroyer Arose, which was a complete write-off. Second, the money to repair the other destroyer, the Volage, which was heavily damaged. And third, and most importantly, compensation for the sailors who were killed or hurt in the explosions.
So, what did the independent experts have to say? Well, their conclusion was definitive. For the 2 warships, the numbers the UK submitted weren't just made up. They were, and I'm quoting here, an exact and reasonable estimate of the real damages. A huge win for the UK's credibility.
And for the most tragic part of the claim, the human cost, the court itself went over all the documents. It concluded that the evidence from the UK government was sufficient proof to justify the money they were asking for to compensate the victims and their families.
So, with every single part of the claim now verified either by experts or by the court itself, all that was left was the final judgment. On December 15, 1949, the court delivered its verdict. The total amount Albania was ordered to pay to the United Kingdom was £843,947.
You can see here how methodical they were. The damages to the ships were confirmed by neutral experts. The human cost was confirmed by the court's own review. Every piece of the UK's claim was checked and validated, leading them right to that final number.
And this is the real takeaway, the so what of this whole story. This case set an incredibly powerful precedent. It showed the world that the international legal system actually had teeth. It could work, and it could hold a country accountable, even if that country tried to boycott the whole process. Justice wouldn't be stopped by an empty chair.
And the final line from the judgment itself leaves absolutely no doubt. The court condemns Albania to pay. The language is just so absolute, reinforcing the court's authority, even in these totally unprecedented circumstances.
But this verdict also leaves us with this huge, lingering question, one that's maybe even harder to answer. You see, it's one thing for a court to order a country to pay up. It's a whole other thing to actually collect that money from a nation that refuses to cooperate. And that opens up a whole new can of worms, doesn't it?